Good morning. Welcome to our last episode this month of Ohio's Wild and Scenic Rivers webinar series. I'm Melissa Yapel. Thank you for joining us today. And I am here with some of our staff from our Scenic Rivers program, and really they're from all around the state today. I have Matthew Smith in Northeast Ohio, Rebecca Perry in Southwest Ohio. If you could wave, Rebecca. And Christina Kukley in Northwest Ohio. And I'm in Central Ohio, so we almost have the whole state covered here. Today we're going to be talking about why, if trees grow on land, why are they important to the water, and maybe some animals that move between land and the water. Matthew's going to be presenting first, and then I'm going to pass it off to, we'll pass it off to Christina. And Rebecca is going to be helping me with questions. So if anybody has questions today for Matthew or Christina, please let us know in the Q&A box. I'll say hello in there in just a minute so you know where it is. And I think I'll send it over to you, Matthew, now to get started.
All right. Let me get the presentation here. All right, can you see the presentation, Melissa?
Yep, you're good.
All right, so welcome to the riparian zone. Why rivers need trees. OhioDNR, the Division of Natural Reserves, has the Scenic Rivers program, and trees along rivers are actually a huge importance to these state scenic rivers. And to give a little brief history, the Scenic Rivers program was created in 1968, and the mission is to protect the natural qualities of Ohio's remaining high-quality streams. Currently, there are 15 state-designated rivers and streams totaling over 830 river miles that are either wild, scenic, or recreational rivers. And the conservation of these state-designated scenic rivers, we have four main things that we do. The first one is review publicly funded projects, which could be bridges or roadways, different things like that. We have a volunteer stream quality monitoring program where volunteers are trained to monitor the water quality of these river systems. We do environmental education, and we also, which is in line with this presentation that we're giving today, is promote healthy riparian zone management. So when we welcome you to the riparian zone, what is a riparian zone? It's kind of a technical name. Well, the riparian zone is simply the land that's adjacent to a river, stream, creek, lake, or even a wetland. So what does this riparian zone look like? Well, this picture kind of gives an overview of how many different viewscapes or different ways that a riparian zone can look. And if you can see, I think I have my mouse hovering, you can see the river going along all through here. And you can see that there's a parking lot that's part of the riparian zone, roadway right here. And if you move more towards the center left of the picture, you can see there's a more wooded corridor through here also. And here's an aerial photograph of, I think it's the Maumee River, and you can see here that the riparian zone has mainly two different types of land uses here. There's a whole lot of agricultural land along this riparian zone, and there's also developments over here. And then in opposition to that, we have this stream system right here, which is Little Beaver Creek. And you can see here how there's vast wooded riparian areas that are very close to the stream. They line the slopes, and you can see the white little trees down there. Those are sycamores. Those are very pretty in the fall, contrasting with the colors. And my slide is, oh, there we go. So, and this is another type of riparian area, and this is a, actually you can see this channel right here is where the creek is running through, and it kind of winds back this way. And this is Pymatuning Creek, which is designated as State Wild and Scenic River. And there's a vast wetland complex in that riparian area with wooded trees in the background that buffers this, this huge wetland complex and the stream itself. Well, why rivers need trees? That's a good question, and we're going to hopefully answer a little bit of that today. There's three main reasons that we're going to cover today. First is stream stability. Second will be water quality. And thirdly will be biodiversity. And this kind of picture kind of illustrates that. Protect and enhance property, which is stream stability, water quality, and wildlife. So first of all, trees help stream stability. I think this picture is one of the best pictures that I have that really show how effective trees are at stabilizing stream banks. And this is myself. I'm in a kayak, and I was actually surveying the Ashtabula River, doing the designation study for that to be included in the Scenic Rivers program. When we came upon this, is like, we gotta get a photograph of this. And you can see how this root system all throughout this stream bank here, those roots have just really connected together, and they're holding all that soil in place. And you can see how the river has eroded around this, underneath and around. And sometime you can see how the tree has been removed. Either it was cut down or it was old and it fell over into the stream. But these roots, even though the tree has died off, is still holding all this soil in place. Now you can imagine if this tree wouldn't be here, how quickly this soil would have eroded away. So the trees play a huge role in stabilizing these stream banks. Here you can see a little bit of a contrast of, on the left-hand side, you can see where this bank has corn rows planted all the way up to the edge of the stream bank. And actually, if you can see here, you can see how there's these corn, this corn right here, that was planted this year. So all this slope is sloughing off, and this corn has a very shallow root system, and they're not able to hold the banks in place. And this farmer is actually losing land out of production that's been planted as we, as when this picture was taken. As opposed to that, you can see to the right, you can see this gentleman in a canoe, and he's paddling down a section of stream, and you can see different root balls sticking out there. You can even see a tree that has fallen, but you can also see, if you see this little bit of green along the bank here, that's vegetation that's kind of holding in place. So although this stream bank is eroding on the right, the vegetation, the trees, they have slowed that erosion process down. And so the land is not being lost as quickly as the picture on the left. So again, this is a great example of the role that trees play in stabilizing those stream banks. Another thing they do is, yes.
Sorry, we have a good question that came in. Somebody asked, how far out from the waterway does the riparian zone extend?
Well, I think it can vary because we have different qualifiers of that. You can see in this picture right here, the riparian zone, I don't think it's a specific defined term like 100 feet or 200 feet. It's just the land that's adjacent. It's kind of the transition area between the terrestrial and the aquatic areas of the stream or wetland. So if you look at the this, there's probably not a whole lot of area through here that would actually be called the riparian zone. There's a lot of upland habitat along the Maumee River, where if we go to this, but actually let's go here to this slope. So you can see this slope here along Little Beaver Creek. This slope kind of extends very quickly high up. I think the elevation difference is 200 or 300 feet. So you may be able to qualify this whole area through here because as riparian area, because there's going to be a lot of different, and we'll get into this later because there's going to be wildlife that specifically use lands that are kind of the transition area between the stream and the upland habitat. And so you'll get a lot of that through that kind of midway up that slope.
And I would think too, if I can interrupt, Matthew, a riparian zone, it's difficult to think of because a riparian zone, it's the transitional portion of the land that the river uses. Right. So you can look at rivers in low water and, you know, it's kind of difficult to gauge where that riparian zone is. It looks smaller, but then when a river experiences a flood, like for example in Northwest Ohio when the Maumee River floods, it can go hundreds and hundreds of feet outside of its channel, and it's utilizing that riparian zone. So it can be very variable by river system and also by rainfall event and just how that river has formed over time.
And that's what I was going to go to in this next slide was, as opposed to Little Beaver Creek where you have the steep slopes where there's less interaction halfway up the slope between the aquatic zone and the upland zone. Here on this Pymatuning Creek, where you have a vast wetland complex where water levels are going to rise and fall, and that floodplain area is going to expand out through here, that riparian area where the upland and the aquatic meet and interact with each other is going to be a lot wider here. Hopefully we are able to answer that for you. It's not a hard to find question depending on the terrain.
Thank you.
So stream stability. So not only with the just trees planted there, but if you leave that area in a natural state, you're going to also have some native vegetation that grows in here. And this is kind of an example to show you the root systems of native plants as opposed to, like, for example, turf grass. Because one of the things we try to encourage is people not to mow right up to the edges of their stream, but to allow natural vegetation to grow, including trees and regular native plants. And you can see the root systems here, how dense and deep these root systems go as opposed to just regular grass. So all these other flowering native plants, they're going to provide an incredible amount of stability to that soil and again, slow that erosion process down. Erosion is a natural process and you can't really stop it, but you can kind of slow it down and kind of mitigate for the erosion that's taking place by allowing these plants to grow. Here's an example on the Chagrin River where a levee was taken out, and to begin that stabilization process to eventually have these trees in the background, they planted all these native plants along that soil so that way that root system could start to develop and hold that soil in place. All right, so we're going to move on to Christina now, and she's going to talk about trees helping water quality.
Oh, yes. So welcome, everybody. Yeah, so my portion is going to kind of answer the question, why do we care? Why are these riparian zones important? You know, how do these riparian zones being unhealthy or unhealthy ultimately impact us as people and what we do every day? Well, on this slide, you can see a satellite image of Lake Erie. This was a special satellite image taken in 2013. And you'll notice that Lake Erie, it's got some green color in it and also has some brown color in it. And so when we don't have healthy riparian zones that trap sediments and nutrients, they ultimately flow through our river systems. And in the case of Northwest Ohio, they end up in the Western Lake Erie Basin. And that's certainly an issue because sediment is not great in our drinking water. And these blooms, not only are they just an eyesore, they can also just be very bad for human health. So there was actually a bloom that was bad enough in 2014 that the city of Toledo lost their drinking water supply for a few days. So that's why these riparian zones are really important. And so I'm going to go through and discuss some sources of sediment and nutrients, how a healthy riparian zone helps to mitigate those, and also how a riparian zone helps promote dissolved oxygen in our streams. So here are some of the sources of sediments and nutrients, and we've tried to cover a variety of places. Some of these sources are pretty specific to Northwest Ohio, some of them are more urban areas, but in general, this is where we get a lot of flush of nutrients and sediment. So in some areas of the state that are very agricultural, you can have lots of livestock in streams. So livestock will come in to drink and they defecate in the water, and they also stir up a lot of sediment. In urban areas, when folks have lawns, it's pretty interesting. If you pull up a satellite image of Google Earth, you can see some urban areas where there are just bright green lawns, and those lawns are bright green due to fertilization, typically with blends of nitrogen. But unfortunately, even though that nitrogen is put down to make that lawn green, there is ultimately some of it that runs off, and that contributes to nutrient loss, and that excess nutrient level isn't really great for our rivers, streams, or even ponds. The center picture for the farm field runoff, this is actually a farm field that was taken, this picture was taken pretty close to just where I live. We had a heavy rainfall event in March of this year, and this is a farm field that doesn't have any kind of growing vegetation on it. It doesn't have a cover crop or anything like that. And when we had this really bad rainstorm, it just dislodged a lot of the sediment and soil on this field. What you can't see in this picture was the rain came down so hard and so much of this sediment was washed and stirred up that it actually flowed across the township road nearby where I was standing and taking this picture. Another example of sediment loss is from home construction. So when housing developments go into place, if they don't have best management practices like silt fence or mulching with straw on the bare land, when you get rainfall events, kind of like our farm fields, that raindrop, each raindrop hitting the soil is like a small explosion that dislodges the sand, silt, and clays that comprise our soils. And they come loose. You can get enough water across the landscape. If there's a little bit of a slope to it, then it all just comes flowing off. And it goes into our nearby drainage areas, our streams, our creeks, and it's an issue. If anybody's ever come up to Northwest Ohio or even some areas in Central Ohio, you can see pretty clearly we've got a lot of artificial drainage up here. There are portions of Northwest Ohio that are some of the most intensively artificially drained areas in the United States, because a lot of Northwest Ohio used to be formerly known as the Great Black Swamp. By draining that swamp, we've been able to open up these very fertile, very productive agricultural lands. And there's a consequence to that, though. Unfortunately, we have all of these drain tile flowing into ditch networks throughout Northwest Ohio. And you can see in the field tiles images, I don't know, Matthew, if you want to point it out with your mouse to help guide folks, but you can see those little black pipes sticking out. Those are all field tile. So those are all little black pipes that are helping to keep that field dry enough to grow a crop. And so we get a rainfall event, the rain comes down on the top of the field, and then it ultimately percolates through that soil and gets to that tile, and the tile is sloped just enough that it'll carry that excess water out to the ditch. And that ditch is that line of water you can see in the image right there. So there's some pretty good research that was done in Northwest Ohio and Central Ohio looking at the amount of sediment and nutrients conveyed by artificial field tile, like in this scenario, and about 80% of our phosphorus that is lost on farm fields is lost through these field tile systems. All right, next slide, Matthew. So we talked about some sources of nutrients and sediment. Well, why is that important? You know, when we get sediment flushes in our streams, the rivers look brown, but just because they're brown and we can't see through them very clearly, is that really an issue? Well, it actually is. Ohio EPA did a study a few years ago looking at major sources of pollution for Ohio's freshwater rivers and streams, and sediment was number one. And once again, if you can remember from our previous slide, sediment is basically just the loss of soil from the landscape, from bare ground or home sites. That's it. So what does that sediment do? Well, that sediment when it gets into a stream, it manages to fill in the interstitial spaces between rocks. And those interstitial spaces between rocks are really important for aquatic life to survive. So for example of this, if you look at the big picture featuring that lovely crayfish face on the left-hand side of the screen. So you can see that crayfish, he's hiding in a river, and he's utilizing the empty spaces, the interstitial spaces between those rocks and the stream bed to hide. So that's a great place for a crayfish to get out of sight of predators. They can stay there and wait for a tasty snack to pass by. Those spaces are really important. The crayfish is just one of many examples of how freshwater organisms need those little spaces between rocks. It's basically their little home. And when we get big flushes of sediment, you can see in the picture in the lower right-hand portion, those little interstitial spaces that would be there end up getting filled in with the sands and silts that are flowing off the landscape from soil loss. And it smothers those habitats, and then our crayfish friend doesn't have his little house to hide in anymore. And so that's a big impact to water quality right there. So that's why sediment and erosion is really important to pay attention to. All right, Matthew, next slide. So then we also talked about nutrients a little bit. When we have a lot of phosphorus is a big nutrient used to grow plants, so is nitrogen. But especially as far as Western Lake Erie Basin is concerned, when we have a large amount of phosphorus loss, that specific nutrient is really good at fueling a harmful algal bloom. So this is an image of Lake Erie. This is a much closer image. You know, we had that satellite image before, just a big landscape-wide picture. When you get to these harmful algal blooms, this is what they look like up close. You've got this green scum on the top of water. And we have this bloom just because of all the nutrients that have come off of our landscape. So it's really important that whether you have a lawn or you have a farm field, it's important to test soils, know how many nutrients you actually need, and try to keep the landscape covered with vegetation so that those nutrients and sediments aren't prone to loss during a heavy rainfall event. All right, Matthew, next slide. So this is the role of healthy riparian corridors, because healthy riparian corridors with lots of trees can help to mitigate these losses of sediment and nutrients on our landscape that impact bodies of water like the Western Lake Erie Basin. So this is a great picture of a forested floodplain this spring functioning the way we would want a forested floodplain or a forested riparian area to work. So if you look at the back of the image, kind of where Matthew's mouse cursor is, that is actually the Blanchard River. There was a big rainfall event that caused the Blanchard River to flood, and now it's flooding out into this area of its forested riparian zone. So if you can notice the pools of water in this image, those are floodwaters from the Blanchard River that are coming up and settling out in this riparian zone. It's great because back at that river, that water is flowing through really fast. And when it has this riparian zone to flood into, that fast flowing water, it slows down. It hits the trunks of those trees in the riparian zone, and that also helps to slow the flow of the water. And so as this water loses its energy in this riparian zone, that's a great opportunity for sediments to drop out, and also for the plants in this riparian zone to utilize those nutrients and keep them out of Lake Erie. The other benefit of having these forested riparian zones is being able to keep dissolved oxygen in water. So this picture on the right is a really great contrast between the benefits of shade on streams and then no shade on a stream. So where Matthew's moving his mouse cursor on the right side of this image, you can see it's really, really dark. And that's great because the more shade we have in a stream, the cooler the water is. And you can kind of think about it on a hot day. If you have the option of sitting in a parking lot or getting underneath a shade tree, where would you rather be to eat your lunch? You'd probably rather want to be under the shade tree. Well, that applies to a lot of aquatic critters as well, because also where that shade is, the water is cooler. And when the water is cooler, it also holds more oxygen. And that's really important because all of our critters that live in our streams, they've got gills and they need that dissolved oxygen in order to be able to survive. All right, so riparian zones are really important, and earlier on, and when I started my talk, I showed that picture of the Western Lake Erie Basin with a lot of sediment in it, and also an algal bloom forming on it. And I just wanted to add that, you know, fortunately in this administration, there's a large priority for keeping our riparian zones healthy, restoring wetlands and floodplains in them if we can. And so we're very fortunate that our governor had the forethought to develop the H2 Ohio program, which is a program that we are using to restore a lot of healthy riparian areas and wetlands and forested floodplains in the Northwest Ohio area and across the whole state of Ohio. So hopefully we'll have more areas that look like the image on the right, and that will help to mitigate the amount of sediment and nutrients we have moving across the landscape, and also help shade our streams to increase our dissolved oxygen levels.
All right, I'm going to be taking back over the presentation here. Thank you, Christina.
Actually, real quick, before Christina goes, since this is pertaining to Northwest Ohio, I want to ask it, and maybe Matthew, you want to answer, I'm not sure, but somebody did write in and said that the Northwest waters have looked scary this year, and how can we test waters in Ohio for high cyanobacteria and other toxins?
Well, there is a specific protocol to test for cyanobacteria, and actually the bloom this year in the Western Lake Erie Basin has been very, very small. Because most of the nutrients that travel through Northwest Ohio, they travel through rainfall events. And this year, we pretty much had a drought. We've had very little rainfall, and with that limited rainfall, fewer sediments and nutrients have been transported off the landscape. So the waters up here this year are actually doing really good. The rivers are in great shape. I survey the Maumee and Sandusky regularly, and they really do look beautiful this year. But in general, that testing for cyanobacteria, that's handled by professionals that follow a specific EPA protocol.
Thanks, Christina.
Sure.
Okay, back to Matthew.
All right, so the last thing that we're covering today is trees help biodiversity. Now, there are lots of animals that are dependent on wooded riparian corridors, from birds to fish to insects to mammals. And actually, there are specific animals or birds that will use these areas that won't necessarily use an upland area as frequently. The same thing with trees. And one of the questions earlier was, how do you tell the difference between where the riparian zone is and how wide it is? Well, there are more water-loving trees that will grow in the riparian area, at least more densely, like sycamore trees or pin oaks or silver maples. So there's different types of tree species that will grow at greater abundance in those riparian areas because their root systems in those trees, they like more of a wet soil type area. So these trees along the rivers, streams, lakes, and wetlands, they provide habitat to many different species, and they do this through woody debris that's in the streams itself, through cavities that are in trees, root systems, and just the trees themselves. So we're going to look here at a kind of a cross section of a stream. This could be a wetland complex. and it's riparian habitat. And if you can see, we have this wooded corridor on each side of this water body. And you can see how, for example, where this fish is at the edge of the stream, but there's this undercut bank right here. And this root system is holding this soil in place. So while the stream has cut underneath there, those roots will hold it in place and maintain that structure for quite some time. And fish love this habitat. There's lots of times, if you're a fisherman, that you'll go out and you'll fish where there's undercut banks because something will be hiding under there. And what they're probably trying to do is prevent from being caught by a great blue heron or a kingfisher or some type of animal predator that's going to dive down, or a bird that would dive down into the water. But also the trees that fall into the stream, they will provide habitat for these animals. And so the first thing we're going to cover is some of the things that actually live in the water that a good wooded or treed riparian zone provide quality waterways, and these species are dependent on that. So we're going to go here to the right, the hellbender salamander. This is actually a state endangered species in Ohio, and it's the largest salamander in the United States. It lives in the Ohio River Basin, and in Ohio, which is Little Beaver Creek, the Kokosing River, Captina Creek, I think, and there's some other systems that still hold these hellbender salamanders, but they're very dependent on very healthy waterways that have a very small amount of sediment coming into them with cooler water. And so those wooded riparian zones along those streams that hold those soils in place, that cool that water temperature down and prevent these rocks from all getting filled in with silt, it's extremely important to these giant salamanders, and they're very dependent on that. Dragonfly nymphs, you can see this top center picture right here. That's the baby dragonfly, the nymph of a dragonfly, which was covered last week in the presentation. These guys, a lot of times, I'm going to go back to the previous slide, they'll live in the vegetation here or underneath these little root mats that are fibrous roots that are sticking into the water, and sometimes in the rocks also. And then stonefly nymphs. If you remember when Christina had covered under the sediment portion entering the water, and she talked about all those spaces in between the rocks. Well, this stonefly nymph, this is actually a giant stonefly, and they really need those spaces in between those rocks to live in. If they don't have those spaces, well, the rock bass that's pictured here in the bottom center, and smallmouth bass and even darters, they're going to gobble those things up and they will disappear, not only because they don't have a place to live, but they won't have a place to hide, and so they'll get eaten up. Blue breast darters, this top left picture here, that actually was once a species that was listed as threatened in Ohio, and it's been removed because some of the water quality in some of our streams that have this darter has increased enough where their populations have expanded. But they also need those gravel substrates in the stream that are not covered by silt. And then we have scuds, and scuds live in the vegetation in streams. If we'll go back to this previous slide here, again, all these little fibrous roots that are sticking in the water right here, and the plants that are in the stream too, those scuds will live in those areas. All right, now we'll go on to some critters that actually use the trees themselves. Now, a honeybee is not an animal or organism that will specifically use riparian areas. They will live in upland species, they'll live in many different areas, but they are dependent on trees and the cavities in these trees, because they can use those cavities to create their hives, because not everybody has boxes out in nature, you know. Only people who are gathering honey to be used and eaten by people will have those boxes. Well, then all the other honeybees that are out there that are in those boxes, they'll go find a tree and a cavity in that tree to make their hive. But if we remove those trees that have those cavities, well, then they won't have a place to build those hives. So here's another species that really is dependent on these riparian areas, or these transitional areas between the upland and the water habitats. And this is a mink. And we photographed this mink on the Pymatuning Creek. And mink will hunt for a little tiny fish or a crayfish or little mammals. They're very opportunistic, and they'll eat just about anything they can catch. But they really like these terrestrial / aquatic transition areas in the riparian zone. And this guy, you can see how he's hiding underneath these exposed roots and little cavities that are cut in there by the water. And again, if those trees, if that forest system wouldn't be in existence there would not be much habitat for these guys to live in. Here's another species that really loves water. It's a larger mammal. It's the river otter. And at one time, there were hardly any river otters in the state of Ohio. And starting in sometime, I believe in the 80s, the Division of Wildlife started a program to try to get river otters reintroduced in Ohio. And one of the stream systems that they were very successful in doing that was the Grand River up in Northeast Ohio. And the reason it was very successful is because the Grand River has a vast wooded riparian corridor. So lots of wild areas, treed areas that are adjacent to the stream, and the stream system has a high biodiversity of fish, mussels, all kinds of insects. So a variety of different things that will support a larger mammal like the river otter. So also birds are very dependent on these wooded riparian areas, and there's some birds that again only live in these areas adjacent to these streams. And one example is the prothonotary warbler, and it's a very beautiful bird. But they specifically nest in these small cavities in trees. And again, so that's why it's important that when these trees have cavities that we don't remove them. And you can see here's one peeking out of the cavity where he probably has a nest in there. And then on the right hand side, this one's entering. And then you can see the small little picture up here with 6 little eggs, and those are actually prothonotary warbler eggs. But they will not build a nest outside of a cavity. They need those cavity spaces to nest. Another cavity nesting species are tree swallows. And you can see here all these little birds peeking out there telling their mom or dad to feed them. There's a feed me, you know, they're peeping like crazy probably. And here's one of the parents flying into the cavity either to build the nest or to feed their young. And you can see here how this tree is not living any longer. It's broken off. It's a dead tree, but it still has a cavity, and it plays an important role in providing nesting habitat for these species. And birds like warblers and tree swallows, one of the really important reasons for us that they're here is they eat lots of insects. So if you want to have less mosquitoes around, it's great to have these tree swallows. So another species that really uses these wooded riparian corridors a lot are ducks. But most people don't associate ducks with trees because you see them swimming all the time out on ponds or lakes or on these big river systems. And they're out there just swimming. Some of them are diving down in the water, and some of them are puddling around on top of the water. But some duck species, like the wood duck and many mergansers, like the hooded merganser on the bottom left, they actually nest in tree cavities along these streams, rivers, lakes, and wetlands. They're very dependent on these trees, and sometimes when there's not enough trees with cavities in them, people will actually put, excuse me, I'm gonna get a drink of water here. People actually put duck boxes out there, and they're kind of like a wooden box that these ducks can nest in. So the bottom right, that's a mom and dad wood duck, and then on the top picture, that's actually a picture of baby ducks. The next picture is a little GIF file that we have, and these birds are not jumping to their demise. They're actually jumping down to a body of water, and their mom or dad are actually probably calling for them, to encouraging them to jump down into the water so they can go swimming and feed. And another thing that these wood ducks are very dependent on these trees that live on along the streams is for food. So wood ducks, they actually eat a lot of acorns. So you have white oaks and red oaks and all kinds of different oak species that produce acorns, and they will eat those acorns during the fall when they're dropping into the water. So another species that's a cavity nester that's really dependent on trees are screech owls. And you can see the two different color phases that we have of screech owls. On the left-hand side, you can see this kind of brownish or rusty colored owl, and it's nesting in a beech tree. And beech trees can live long time with these large cavities in them. And the one on the right, look how camouflaged it is on this tree. This tree almost looks like a silver maple. I'm not quite sure which kind of tree this is here, but you can imagine if this cavity is 10 feet up in the tree and you're kind of walking along the trail or something next to a tree, how it'd be very difficult to spot that owl up in the tree because it's camouflage. So another species that uses trees now, they don't live there, they're not cavity nesters, but they build these there's nests in these trees, and the nest isn't very complex. It's kind of just like a patch of sticks and twigs that they've gathered together, and they lay on the tops of these trees very high up. They have many times used large sycamore trees and other tree species also, but they also nest in colonies, and they're called rookeries. And there's many different places you can go and find these great blue heron rookeries, but they're always in association along water bodies, either in the floodplains or along in wetland complexes, along streams or lakes, different things like that. And but one of the things you want to be careful with is you don't want to get too close to these rookeries when they're nesting, because one of the defense mechanisms of a great blue heron is actually to vomit whatever it's eaten down upon things that are below that they think are actually could be causing some type of danger to their baby birds. So don't get close to them. It's could be a nasty experience for you. But again, this is a species of bird that are very dependent on water sources. You'll see these great blue herons fishing in our waterways, but again, they nest in these riparian corridors, and that's why it's very important to make sure that these treed areas are in place next to our streams. So another bird that's associated a lot with our streams, rivers, lakes. Lake Erie has so many bald eagles now, and so does the state of Ohio. I remember when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, I don't think I ever remember seeing a bald eagle at all. And there were very few bald eagles in the state of Ohio then. Well, bald eagles have made a huge comeback, but one thing that bald eagles do is they come back to the same nest year after year, and they'll continuously build it deeper and deeper and deeper. And some of these nests are over 4 feet deep, and they're very large, and they can be very heavy. And so they're very dependent on trees, especially large trees that can support these nests. You can see here how this, you can see this nest way far out across this wetland complex in the top right. And then up closer, we're still down below the tree, so it's because it's a tall tree, you can't kind of grasp how large that nest is. So, in summary, welcome to the Riparian Zone, why rivers are needed. We covered 3 basic principles of why it's so important to have trees along our river systems. First, we covered stream stability. If you remember how and that picture shows how those root systems really hold that soil in place and slow down the erosion process, not only just by the root systems, but also by the structure itself of that water brushing up against the trees, slowing that water down. Second was water quality. and how those trees remove sediments. They help that sediment drop out of suspension in the water before it gets into our lakes. And it removes also filtering the nutrients that come into our waterways. And then also they provide shading to our water, so that way there's more dissolved oxygen in our waterways. And lastly, we covered biodiversity. There's so many different species of birds and animals that specifically use these riparian areas for habitat, and you won't find them for the most part in the upland areas. So what are some things that you can do? Some of the things that you can actually do are plant trees. There's groups out there that will have tree plantings, and they'll need volunteers to do that. If you own property next to a lake or stream or wetland, you can limit the amount of mowing that you do next to those rivers, streams, lakes, and wetlands. Also, if there's a safe location, of course, if it's next to somebody's house, or sometimes in our parks, if there's a trail right there, we have to remove some of the dead trees. But if you have trees that are in safe locations and they won't hurt somebody or your property, leave those dead trees in place, so that way the cavity nesters will continue to have a place to nest. When erosion is taking place, use natural stream bank stabilization methods. Those trees, if you can use a practice by planting trees or small willow trees, different things like that to stabilize the banks, you'll have most of the time a more successful planting. And last,
did Matthew, are you there?
Well,
Christina?
I can go ahead and take over.
Okay.
So, lastly, you can always feel free to contact a conservation group. There are lots of great conservation groups that work to maintain healthy riparian corridors. You can always contact one of us at the Ohio Scenic Rivers program. You can get the information and our contact information from OhioDNR.gov. We are in the Division of Natural Areas and Preserves and Scenic Rivers. So you can find us that way. You can also contact groups like the Nature Conservancy, or depending where you're at in the state, you may be able to contact your county soil and water conservation district office, or there may be a watershed group near you.
Christina, quick question.
Yeah, absolutely.
What kind of bugs live in the riparian zone? Can you name a couple that we have? Riparian Rick, who's asking.
Yes, I was looking at some of those questions. So yes, we've got lots of critters that live in there. So let me see, I'll pull up the picture here. So going back to Matthew's portion of the presentation, we had, crayfish, we had dragonflies, we had scuds. So those are critters that live in the streams. You can also find mayflies. We have some really fun YouTube videos that you could find on the DNR YouTube page about hellgrammites and crane flies. I'm trying to share this stuff here. It's just not working for me. Oh, well. But anyway, I know Alyssa had shared a link to the coloring book that came out. So I would encourage everybody, if you want to see all the different kinds of critters that live in our streams. Oh, and Matthew's holding it up now that he's back with us. Certainly check out the activity book, because you can see pictures of each of the critters. You can understand how they represent a healthy or unhealthy stream when we're surveying for them. And you can learn a little bit about what each thing does. Some of them are pretty cool. I highly recommend look at the hellgrammites. Hellgrammites are awesome.
And actually, if I may jump in there, hellgrammites in the breeding process, the females will lay their eggs underneath trees that are overhanging streams and rivers and lakes. So that's why it's very important for trees to be along our streams for like the hellgrammite, because if they can't lay those eggs underneath the limbs and tree branches and hanging over the water. When those eggs hatch, they won't have water to drop down into to survive because they're a water species when they're larval.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for the presentation today. I think we are getting close to time, so unless anybody has any last minute questions, I'm gonna wrap it up here. So thank you, Christina and Matthew, and then behind the scenes, thank you, Rebecca, and we also had Ryan. You couldn't see him today, but he was here. Ryan Moss, who's also in Northeast Ohio near Matthew. Just want to thank everybody for joining, but let you know that while this series is over, we do have more on the way. So next month we have 2 new series, one on reptiles and amphibians. That'll begin September 2nd, Wednesdays at 10. We'll be talking about venomous snakes, other Ohio snakes, turtles, frogs, a whole bunch of cool things. And then we also have our Division of Forestry with a new series, logging on with the Division of Forestry. That'll be Tuesdays at 10, starting September 8th. And we'll also we have a ton of cool topics to talk about with them, such as urban forestry versus rural forestry, tree ID, and wildfire prevention. You might notice your grass is maybe a little drier than it has been lately. Mine sure is. And it's only going to get drier as we continue on, into the fall. And so we got to talk about how to, prevent any fires from happening around us. And so our forest professionals will tell you about that, and we hope to see you then. I did see one question come in. So before we go, I'm going to ask, we had Bethany ask, is H2 Ohio focused only on state-owned properties, or is there any work being done with privately owned properties? Christina, is that a question for you?
Oh yeah, I got that. So in H2 Ohio, we are working everywhere, and we are also working with a lot of private landowners as well. So where it's made sense, we've worked on some state properties, or in some cases gotten additions to them. If we could do wetland restoration on that land addition. There are several private landowners that we're working with that already have awesome wetland complexes up by Lake Erie, and so we're working with them to see if we can reconnect those wetlands to Lake Erie so they can interact with Lake Erie waters more often, or take on nutrient-laden water from agricultural ditches. So yes, we are working across the gambit, and actually the majority of our projects involve private lands.
Yeah. So I guess with that being said, looks like we've got all the questions taken care of. So we will see you hopefully next month. Take care, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks.